things that could completely shut down an industry overnight, right? There's not many things like we've got a lot of risks, with the economy, with wagering, with infrastructure, or doping positives, but there's not many scandals that could actually shut the gates. And wealth, I think nearly welfare is it, and so it's getting to the point that it's terrifying them, which is good. It should.
Hi, I'm Karen Luke and welcome to Changing Rain. This week we are lucky to have communications expert and founder of Kick Up for Racing in Australia, Vicky Leonard. Early in her career, Vicky was a marketer at Arrowfield Stud, and from that beginning she has gone from strength to strength. Vicky is passionate about racing and equally passionate about improving horse welfare within racing because she wants to ensure the industry has a sustainable future. And she is not afraid to have the tough conversations. Vicky likens herself to a defense lawyer in a murder case. She wants to know all the facts, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Key to Vicky's approach is looking at the challenge of poor horse welfare in sport and racing through the lens of a business problem. So, if your business or organisation relies on the horse industry, this episode is definitely for you. We really hope you enjoy the conversation, and if you do, please subscribe and tell your friends about us. Also, writing a review is a great way to support the show and will help others find us. Thanks for listening. We really hope you enjoy this episode of Changing Rain.
Vicky, it's great to have you here on Changing Rain. I've known you for quite some time, but I know that in 2017 in particular, you wrote a series of blog posts about threats to the future of horse racing. They were probably quite prescient at the time. And you got a response probably more than you expected. Maybe you would tell us a little bit about the background to writing those articles and what happened next.
Sure. So at the time of writing those blogs, leading into it, I guess, there'd been quite an interesting situation happen in New South Wales around greyhound racing, where there was a 7:30 report, so basically a story on ABC that revealed some pretty startling practices in the greyhound racing industry. So the two main ones that I suppose captivated everybody's attention were live baiting. They were using like possums and rabbits that were alive to train these dogs, and then also puppies were being killed before they even reach a decent age if they didn't have the traits that suited breeders. But then of course what came of that again was pressure around what happens to aftercare and what happens to the dogs post-racing. And the New South Wales government quickly sprang into action and responded to the social pressure. I would say they overcorrected. They completely mistook the Australian public's response to it, and came out saying that it was banned. So it was a very topical conversation because what happened was rural Australia really spoke up and said, you can't do that, like it's un-Australian to not let us be able to fix a problem before you ban it. So that was the core arc of the issue. Now, because it had been so topical in the media, I was studying my MBA, and it was probably the first time I'd really spent a decent amount of time with people outside the racing industry bubble. And what was really shocking was that when we were having debates and discussions within our class, they were lumping thoroughbred racing and greyhound racing together. And so I was quite surprised by that because, to somebody who works in the industry, they feel incredibly different and don't have that many similarities. And I was like, yeah, but we couldn't live bait in thoroughbreds, and no, foals don't get, put down before they made it into their racing career, and even then, so I was pretty shocked at the similarities they were drawing, and went back to my full-time job at the time was at Arrowfield Stud and discussed it with John Massara and said, look, if this group of people is representative of young Australians, and it's a pretty smart, I guess, culturally diverse group of people between the ages of sort of 25 and 35, if this is an accurate representation of what they think, we've got a pretty massive problem here. And John was quite shocked as well. In fact, everyone really was in the Arrowfield office, and he gave me a budget to go off and try and quantify if the problem was a big issue in Australia, or if it was just really a subset that we'd come across. And the results came back pretty startling, really. They came back really showing that the average young Australian was not remotely comfortable with horse racing. It was largely off the back of the scandal around greyhound racing, and that they were lumping the two together. However, the Melbourne Cup at that point had a particularly bad run with fatalities, and that's the one race a year where the average Australian pays attention to horse racing. So we had a few issues to deal with, and off the back of that data, we had some quantifiable information then, and I wrote, the first blog was, how our industry must change to survive, and got into a lot of what, to be honest, I'm now executing 8 years later, I suppose it would be, 7 years later. So, it went quite viral at the time, because the thing, I guess, is that every country is going through the same thing. There's not a huge amount of difference between the challenges that we're all facing in terms of social pressure, certainly how we're dealing with it, and how the business plan operates in different countries varies, but every country really has pretty similar challenges. So there was people from all around the world reaching out, wanting to chat about it and see what somebody of that demographic, which I was at the time, a little bit older now, but that fitted into it, what we thought could happen as a solution, and how we could resolve it.
I really like what you said there about it being un-Australian not to be able to fix the problem rather than ban it. And that seems to be, has kind of permeated our podcast too, because that's what we're always saying. Let's see if we can solve this rather than ban this, or whatever it might be. Are there ways of fixing it? So,
it's interesting. Behavioural psychologists they talk about that quite a bit. They say that you're not expected to be perfect. The industry is not expected to be perfect and doesn't have to be perfect, but you've just got to show progress. And if you can show, that you're on a path to improving, then most people are actually quite comfortable understanding that there's a gap. But if you're trying to fill it, then we get you. We get that not everything's going to be 100% spot on 100% of the time. So that's where I think they really overstepped, and whoever was guiding that particular politician completely misread the social fabric of rural Australia in particular. He actually completely got booted, as a side note, from being in politics. He lost his job as Premier of New South Wales, and I think that's the thing, right? You want a fair go, and so people have given the opportunity to change. Now, an interesting sidebar, I don't know if you've seen, but in the last couple of weeks, New South Wales greyhound industry is completely under fire again. It's 7 years later, and the head vet at greyhound racing in New South Wales resigned, and when he resigned, he came out with a letter saying that nothing had actually changed in that 7 years, and that the only thing that's changed and improved has been they've changed the definition of what constitutes rehoming. I mean, I think the live baiting's largely been quashed, but the aftercare really hasn't. So they're now in a different quandary because they've been given the opportunity to fix it and sort of haven't. So it's going to be interesting to see how that one pans out.
It really is interesting, and it seems that the vets are starting to speak up a little bit. When these things are coming to a head, the vets are starting to speak out. I'm just curious, Vicky, one of the things that I think makes it difficult to sort of have conversations with people, and I know you're a communications person, is the fact that sometimes I feel like different people might have different definitions of welfare. So I'm just really curious, what do you think the average person in the racing industry, how do you think they think about welfare?
That's quite interesting because we have, over here, we've got the Equine Welfare Fund, which is driven by each state, and somewhere between 1% and 2%, like in New South Wales it's 1.5% of prize money goes into this welfare fund. Now, Victoria recently have had a situation where they have come under fire by their rehomers, the aftercare providers, for not providing enough funding to them and being like, where's this $4 million going? New South Wales, unfortunately, don't even disclose it. So they're it's frustratingly opaque. But in Victoria, what happened was the average person in the industry had defined welfare as aftercare and rehoming, but they brought out the list of where it all goes, and it goes into track safety, it goes into diagnostics, preventative medicine, it goes into investing in really good tools for vets, it goes into more regulation vets. So welfare, whilst I guess we probably haven't done a great job of defining it and making it, sharing that it's actually a lot more broad than just where horses go after racing, and it's actually it's encompassing their whole career and making sure that they are treated in the best way they possibly can throughout. I'm not sure that everybody understands that though, so it's an interesting question, that.
No, that would be my experience too. I think most people I know in racing would say it encompasses health care particularly, and general husbandry, feeding, nutrition, housing, and once they're all sorted, that horse has good welfare. And I think that's where the live like kings idea comes from, because the perception is it's been provided at the highest possible level. We have the best diagnostics, we have the best veterinary care, so ergo the welfare must be perfect. But they're actually missing the perspective of the horse. How does the horse feel about this? I think that's if I was to take anything out of what I've learned over the last couple of years, it's that welfare goes further than what racing people, in my experience, understand by the term.
Yeah.
Do you have any ideas or thoughts, Vicky, about trying to tease out that definition amongst people within the industry? Or
Yeah, I think we just need, as a rule, the industry is very bad communicators. We tend to operate in our own bubble and reinforce our own ideas. I don't think that's unique to our industry over any other. But the general conversation around welfare has never happened. So the welfare conversation has probably been just what they've thought and what's been repeated. But you can easily put ideas into that. It's not hard, by doing content. By the 5 domains model, it's probably the one that's the most easy to understand, and it's pretty clear, that that an animal should live pain-free, has the right to certain things, and it doesn't matter if that animal's a sheep that's going to end up being eaten, or if it's your pet dog. So we could definitely normalise it and make those definitions more comprehensive and better understood just by presenting it in a way and repeating it and bringing it into conversation all the time. But changing the culture to embrace that conversation, it's starting to happen. It's definitely starting to happen, but it hasn't been commonplace yet.
one of the things that I've noticed amongst amateur horse owners is that when you start that conversation about welfare, it's almost a knee-jerk reaction of something being taken away, oh, you might stop us doing this or stop us doing that. Do you think we can kind of flip it around and actually, because the improving the welfare is almost like the gift of, yes, we can keep going. Do you think that's a message that we could work with?
Yeah, I guess when you say it makes them quite defensive at the moment. But so it's interesting, in New South Wales, there has been a real push from the entire industry, certainly starting from certain sectors and certain individuals, but a push for better transparency around where the equine welfare fund's going, what's happening to these horses post-racing, because it's just not disclosed. And it's interesting that the more Racing New South Wales dig their heels in and don't disclose it, the louder the industry is getting together to demand it. And it's actually probably, I think, been a good thing in the long term, because it's a bit like everyone's like, yeah, this isn't okay. It's a bit smelly. And even people that were the biggest fans of the administration and the way they were being run even a year ago are not comfortable at all with the lack of disclosure now. So there's a little bit of that, I suppose, human nature of, going against the grain, and because they won't say anything, it's now really becoming quite contentious. So, and as a result, I'd say that whole expectation around information disclosure and finding out what our administrators are doing to protect the industry is being demanded more, because we just haven't been afforded the choice to give our own opinion. We're not even able to, because we don't know what's happening.
So this could be a kind of a watershed, because people will start to say, I didn't think welfare was just aftercare. I thought it was other things, and no one told me that that's what the definition was. So those conversations will start.
Definitely. I mean, at the moment, so right now there's actually an inquiry into the sale of into the sale of a racetrack, but what's been dragged into it is welfare. And the head of the Animal Justice Party in New South Wales, Emma Hurst, has really driven this whole inquiry and brought the animal welfare conversation into the sale of a racetrack conversation. And it's probably the first time that a commercial decision has had welfare completely underpinning it. And the whole conversation on the first day of the inquiry was nearly entirely about the major implications of the funding model not being strong enough to underpin a safe environment for racehorses. And it's getting quite, to be quite the actual conversation that's driving this whole commercial decision, which is great. And I'd say it's the first time that's ever happened.
Interesting. Yeah. And so they're saying that we need to sell this racecourse because we need funding to make sure the welfare of our racehorses is protected. Is that a simplistic way of looking at it?
It's kind of gone on both sides, right? So the group that wants to sell it is like, well, you need good funding. The industry needs funding to be able to build proper infrastructure. However, everyone knows there's about 300 million sitting in the coffers for infrastructure that hasn't been spent. So it's a little bit like, no, you're calling that out. Rosehill is actually a spot that has great air conditioning. It's got the facilities for the horses to be comfortable. It's got great surfaces for them to train on. It's got well-trained professionals nearby. That's what's really important, is that we know that this facility does present actually a great foundation for racehorses to be trained out of. So it's really bringing into the conversation all these different variables about what actually goes into making sure a horse is trained well. And that's hitting the public domain. So that's actually reaching, the mainstream media. And they're seeing now, okay, oh gosh, there's actually physios and there's nutritionists and there's vets that are like seeing these horses every day. And that's getting brought into this conversation just about selling the racecourse. So I guess it's normalising it, and it's come from both directions, but it really is, normalising the conversation. That element is getting definitely hugely prioritised in all this, in this massive decision making. Like, this is what they're valuing at a $5 billion asset, and horse welfare is a huge variable in it, which is great. It's good to see that it's being prioritised so much.
Well, that's absolutely fascinating. The equestrian world, Vicky, was rocked recently by a video that came out of the Olympian dressage rider Charlotte Dujardin, seen whipping one of her horses in a training session with a student. She withdrew from the Olympics. She apologised for her action. She said it was a lapse of judgment. She was being provisionally suspended by the FEI pending investigation. You wrote an op-ed piece where you said that it sent smoke signals to the racing industry. What's in those smoke signals? I'm fascinated because it is a moment when our worlds are colliding, in my own view. But what do you see in those smoke signals?
Well, I think it just really opened up the use of horses in sport, full stop. That was certainly flooding social media channels about it, was very much undertones like, well, if you think that's bad, you should see what they do in horse racing. So it very much brought our industries together, and often the equestrian community can look down a bit on the thoroughbred industry, and the thoroughbred industry probably looks down a bit on the equestrian community. So it's actually a matter of realising that it is one, and like you only needed to see the last Olympics, how quickly they made a move to take show jumping out of that pentathlon. I think this year's the last year that they
Yes.
have had it. So it gets a little bit scary when you go, well, to bring horses into the Olympics, there's all these other annoying things they have to do anyway around quarantine and the facilities they have to build. It might just be too hard, and it might be quite easy just to remove it as an Olympic sport. And I think that brings in another huge quandary for the thoroughbred racing industry, because I had off-the-track thoroughbreds because I watched the New Zealand eventing team as a 5, 6, 7-year-old at the Olympics competing on off-the-track thoroughbreds. And that aspiration, I mean, there's not a lot that are in it, but there are several, and it's an accessible way to actually get to quite a high level without having to fork out for a warm blood, right? It's a really accessible way of getting a very athletic breed of horse and being able to compete at a decent level. Without that aspirational value, I see it having a huge impact on the appeal of off-the-track thoroughbreds in the equestrian community, and the little kids that actually look at their athletes and they go, whoa, that's awesome. There was one in the Australian team. There was an off-the-track thoroughbred came in, and it was awesome. And I think there's a massive issue there that if the Olympics do end up removing horse stupers, there's a lot of implications for racing that I don't think racing people would even think about. The premise for the blog was, I suppose, more around the lines of specifically the whip. I feel quite strongly that our industry will have to remove it sooner rather than later. I don't necessarily believe that it's a welfare thing. I mean, I always sort of try and turn to science to get a clear answer on whether issues are genuine issues or perceived issues. And there isn't really a definitive answer about if the padded whip does cause pain. There's a lot of papers for, there's a lot of papers against. So I certainly wouldn't want to be on the receiving end of, 10 of J-Max best. But the issue, I guess, on there is that there's an information gap that's there for sure. But the values chasm is enormous. Like, there is no way that anybody is going to be comfortable with an animal getting hit. It's illegal to hit humans. You would never dream of doing it to your dog. And in fact, if you ever did it in public to your dog with a padded whip, and I said in the blog, even with a pool noodle, like, you can imagine a dog cowering and running away. And you would be, like, everyone at the park would want to pin you down. So how is it ever going to be okay for racing to get away with it? And so that values chasm just can't be overcome. I don't believe it can ever be overcome. There's a lot of things that can be. So there's a lot of misinformation around about 2-year-olds and whether we're working our thoroughbreds too young. The science on that's definitive and amazing. Like, it's fascinating to look into. But, with the whip, I mean, this is, it's just too hard and too difficult and never going to be able to be accepted by the everyday, I say the everyday Australian, because, we're not catering to, the hardcore extremists that want to end the sport. We're catering to the usual everyday person that if you go down to the pub or if you talk to your grandma about it, are they going to be comfortable? And that's the social proof barometer that racing needs to judge itself on.
Yeah,
just with regard to the 2-year-old racing, I don't know that the science is definitive. I think there's a lot of science around the musculoskeletal health of 2-year-olds and racing, but I think there could be more science done on the actual welfare of racing such young horses. I think there's different perspectives, but I think a lot of that science, which is quoted as being definitive, is quite limited to a very biological view of welfare.
It'd be interesting if you were to design a study, though, Karen, to look at the psychological health or well-being of 2-year-olds. How would you even go about it? How would you measure it?
Yeah. And look, I 100% agree. I think it's probably impossible to measure in that way. But I think to say that it's definitively fine is perhaps not quite covering all the aspects of welfare that a modern animal welfare scientist might look at. Yeah.
Sure.
And,
Yeah, I
and
mean,
I,
I'm talking, purely more from, I suppose, keeping horses sound and having them race comfortably and pain free. That that working them younger has proven to be one of the best things that we can do.
I remember 6 or 8, 10 years ago when I first kind of became aware of the welfare debate around racing. I think the 4 topics that people would bring up with me. One was the doping, anti-doping control, whatever that might be. The second was falls and fatalities. The third was aftercare. And the fourth was the whip. They're the 4 kind of, if you mention welfare to racing people, they're the 4 things they pick up on. And funny enough, the whip is the one, and everyone supports increased anti-doping controls and measures. Everyone supports better, safer racing surfaces and safer obstacles. Everyone supports improved aftercare. But once you start mentioning the whip, they say no, because then we'll have the slippery slope and it'll all be finished. It seems to be a triggering topic for people. And I'm with you, Vicky. I really do think it's going to have to go. But you meet this really strong opposition from people say, if we go there, well then racing is finished. And I've really struggled trying to articulate a defence saying no, it's not. That's one thing does not lead to the next. Doesn't work like that.
Yeah, I find that such a lazy argument. Like, it's just, it frustrates me because it's a cop-out way of our leadership not having to address it and have the hard conversations. And it pops up all the time here, and there's one administrator in particular that uses the slippery slope argument, and I aggressively disagree with it. Because if a boat is leaking, you put a plug in it, and that's leaking our boat.
Yes.
It's not a snowball. Yeah. It's a leaking, like, for every... I mean, I liken public perception of our sport, and I hate the term social licence because it's just... It's a little bit like, oh, who gives you that? And it's already, I think, got that buzzword feel about it that people in the industry get their back up against. So I like to talk about public acceptance, right? So public acceptance, in that I liken it to a bath. And you've got the bath, had been full of water, and for every scandal... or for every systemic issue that gets brought up or gets raised or gets publicised, there's another hole that gets drilled into the bottom of the bath, and it leaks out approval. So the bath's filled with water, which is our approval, our positivity in the public arena, and it dribbles out and it falls out. And if it's a systemic issue, it comes out a lot. It's a big hole. I mean, if it's a bad egg, it's a small one, but actually it can end up getting clogged up and dealt with, and generally in actually quite a positive way, because it shows that we have regulations and rules that address it. But the whip is a big hole, and unless that gets plugged, you can't even turn on the taps to start filling that tub up again and start building positivity around what we do and showcasing, because they don't care. People won't even listen to the positive elements that we have in the industry, because they're like, you hit your horses. So it basically negates a lot of the positive, in fact, the majority of the positive stuff that we do. I mean, I spoke to a group of students a couple of days ago, and I love talking to students because immediately I go, okay, what are your concerns? Tell me what really, and well, I won't be offended, because they don't feel often that they can ask negative questions about the industry, or why do you do that? And we love them. Me and the Kick Up team, we love hearing them, because that's our next wave of content, or it's our next wave of hitting up our authorities to be like, why aren't we doing something about this? It sits in either one bracket or the other. But if we can defend it, we'll try and build content out and show what's going on. And it would be for every 100 kids, and I mean 15 to sort of 25-year-olds, of every 100, 95 would be the whip. Wow. It's just so visual. And it's used when the most eyeballs are on the race, when the horses are the most fatigued. I just see that as just such a huge, enormous gap that it's not this.
Why do you think there's such resistance? Because to me it just seems like such a relatively simple thing to change.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I know that several states here want it and have tried to push for it to be banned. I wouldn't be surprised if it did happen. It's just there's certain leadership that's stopping any discussion of it, and I just think I'm not entirely sure. I mean, there could be a number of reasons. I certainly know that a lot of old jockeys, or even current jockeys, but certainly the older generation, are probably a lot more dogmatic that it should remain and say that it's a safety issue, for safety reasons and steering. But surely taking a hand off the rein is a bigger safety issue, and you can still carry it. I'm not going to lie, like watching the eventing in the Olympics, you actually barely notice that they carry a crop around cross-country and show jumping, because they barely use it. It's there just in case they kind of need it, and so you don't even really notice it. And that's the difference between, eventing and horse racing, is that it's such a visual element in our industry. But I'm not entirely sure. I do think here for certain it's what underpins it, I guess, is pressure, from people that don't like change, and people are scared of change because. When things change, it means that they're not currently working, which means your beliefs are old, you feel dated, you feel like the industry you know and are familiar with no longer is relevant, and so you work to protect it. That's human nature, unfortunately.
Yeah, I guess unless you just embrace it and say, you know what, I'm going to be the vanguard and I'm going to lead it to a great future. So as far as I know, I think there's racing without whips in Norway.
Yeah, there is, correct. And like the science has been quite definitive. What's come out of there that it has made no difference to race times. South Africa held a series as well of whip-free racing, and it was also deemed a success. So I'd love to see. In fact, I'd love to see a country like, I say this in New Zealand. Like Australia's being slow on this. Come on, Kiwis, show it to them. And there's a massive appetite for it. I just it's a conversation they need to have. But I'd love New Zealand to take the bull by the horns and show the world what they can do.
Yeah, I think there's probably cultural issues specifically around gambling. One of the major jurisdictions, Hong Kong, has no rules around the whip, because a jockey who is not seen to be whipping the horse to maximum capacity is not trying. From the puncher's perspective, and Hong Kong is a jurisdiction that's driven very strongly by the expectations of the punters. So it's a tricky one. It's worth looking at races. I've started to do this in recent times. Look at races where they've called an interference inquiry or something, and just watch what precipitates that. And it's often the whip. It's partly probably, as Vicky says, because the rider becomes unbalanced. It may also be the horse drifting away from that impact. Now, one strike, fair enough, they can correct them, but if they continue to do it and then they cause interference and everyone says, oh, there was interference, well, if he didn't have a whip, or certainly didn't use the whip in that way, the interference mightn't have happened. So I just think that's an interesting way of looking at things. You mentioned light up for racing. So you have kick up for racing in Australia, Vicky, and then you more recently expanded your reach into America, and you have light up for racing. And I'm interested in, because I've just mentioned there about cultural differences, I'm interested in the cultural differences that you might have encountered between Australia and the States. How did you find that?
Yeah, there's a lot of differences in racing in Australia and America. I guess Australia's tiny in comparison, and in Australia, racing's very much part of the cultural fabric. So, like your local racetrack in the bush, they're big race meetings, and the local community band together. That underpinning of the industry you don't have that so much in the States. Certainly in the big jurisdictions, it's very corporate. They're privately owned tracks. There's a lot to the business model that underpins quite major cultural differences in how racing is run and developed. And America's large. It's divided because there's no major, I suppose, central point that has full autonomy and control over what happens. Thankfully, they've brought in an organisation that can now do that from a drug testing and from a racetrack safety perspective, which has already seen enormous improvement in things like fatalities, but also just making sure there's consistency around a whole lot of variables that previously were just not up to standard. Whereas in Australia, we've had that principal racing authority in each state, and they ensure a standard that's applied across the board, and they work together on the Australian rules of racing. So I guess the business model is very different. The industries are really different, and that tends to drive, I guess, a lot of the cultural decision makings and the why people do what they do. Also in America, the different states are very different. So, Kentucky, it's centered around the horse. The locals of Kentucky, like they love it. It's an amazing place to visit. Lexington and Louisville, and see how the racing is so beautifully embraced in the community. Whereas, obviously in a state like California, which tends to be a lot more progressive and is often quite a social barometer for change. They had that situation at Santa Anita a few years ago with a cluster of fatalities that they really had to act quickly, and they have. Like, the leadership that they showed to address things and bring in changes fast and major was a great lesson that everybody in the world should be looking to see what they did and what they implemented and what they've learned from it. And then you go to Florida, and Florida, of course, is the whole industry there is underpinned by 2-year-old sales, which has its challenges too. There's a lot of differences. The reason that we're actually got a different name, and kick up in Australia, so we use that as a bit of a term in Australia to, kick up for something, to stand up for something, to get your back, to get behind it. That phrase actually doesn't even exist really in America. They didn't know what kick up was, so that's why we changed the name and called it Light Up. So Light Up Racing kicked off there earlier this year, and it's driven by a great board with some awesome people on it. Dr. Jeff Burke, who's a legend, I'm sure you know well, in the veterinary space, and just a group of people that are genuinely passionate about having the best interests of the horse at the forefront, and ensuring that our messages and our positioning is making sure the industry is in a sustainable position to survive and thrive. So it's been great. It's been they've actually ended up quite quickly being quite different organisations and how challenges are approached and what's needed. But equally, we've been able to get in there and get stuck in and got a lot of support from the communities, which is fantastic because they are grassroots driven initiatives. So relying on the community to get behind it.
Why do you think that they're different? What makes, is it a cultural thing again?
So, I guess the difference has been a little bit how they were established as well. So Kick Up was established off the back of those blogs that you spoke about when we kicked off, when we started. So it's been, so I set up my own marketing company a few years after finishing, graduating from my MBA, and it was called Kick Collective. And I set up that marketing company specifically because I tried to get a national perception marketing campaign off the ground, and went around and had meetings with the CEOs and the chairmans of each state racing authority, and basically got a pat on the head and a run along little girl response, and it really made me want to get stuck in and get it done despite them. So it's a really good book by Ryan Holiday called The Obstacle is the Way. And so I was like, if you can't go through it, you've got to go over it or around it or underneath it. So I set up Kick Collective to actually get Kick Up off the ground. And so after we'd been established 3 years, it was about entering our 4th year. The team was large enough at that point to absorb the cost of taking on and the workload of taking on this initiative. So Kick Up whilst there's been a little bit of support from external people, individuals mainly, and a few groups that have done fundraising events on our behalf, Kick Up is basically driven by the team at Kick Collective and is an internal initiative. So we rely a lot on the skills we already have. And the other big difference is in Australia, and I think it's largely, to be honest, you can nearly credit possibly Gay Waterhouse for this, but trainers are very good on social media, and the farms are very good on social media too. So Gay was probably the first one who started doing very consistent horse updates to owners using videos and then sharing them. And then, of course, you might as well share that on socials because you've got the content already built. And so Aussie trainers are great, and they show all sorts of things that are going on in the stable and in the yards and updates on horses. Now, that's not done in America. There's probably only a handful of trainers I can think of that are even remotely active on social media at all. Graham Motion's excellent. Dan Black is awesome. But really, Tom Morley is good, but it's very much, there's a huge gap in public access to behind the scenes experiences. And so what we needed to do in the States is really start giving people the confidence and the tools to be able to generate a lot of this content themselves. Because whilst, Light Up can do it and does do its own content marketing strategy and push that out, the most effective content is that's genuine and authentic and comes from the organisation that is doing it. And a lot of what we think and do every day in our industry, we think is quite mundane because, of course, we do it every day, but it's actually fascinating to the public. And so that's what we've been trying to encourage in America, is really get the community behind sharing to their networks and having the confidence to word things in the right way so that it can be shared and grow within the community. So we've got 4 pillars for both organisations. One is, the first one is addressing misinformation, so making sure that, that discussions that aren't true get corrected, and making sure that the science that's invaluable and industry progress gets communicated. Then there's amplifying positivity, so showcasing best practice and people out there that are doing an amazing job. The third pillar is community, and that's empowering the community to spread ideas, to share, and to reveal what goes on in their lives and giving them those tools. And the fourth is industry accountability, so pushing our leadership to ensure, not even just leadership, making sure that we keep each other accountable and ensure that a culture of welfare is actually active within the industry. So that third pillar has been the one that we've really concentrated on with Light Up, and coming soon we'll have a whole series of cohort trainings around the States where we take them through the skills to be able to communicate and learn about content generation and push it out there to their networks. So that's been a big focus for the US organisation.
In Changing Rain, we have this metaphorical tent. And in this tent, everyone who has an interest in equine welfare is welcome. I visualise this tent as having open sides. It doesn't have flaps. It's not a closed tent. It's somewhere where people can come and go. And so you're in that tent, obviously, we're in that tent, and you're pushing out content. That content doesn't just stop at the edges of the tent. It goes out into the wider community, which includes people who maybe have, different views on horse sport, racing, all that sort of thing, whether it's sustainability, it's viability. Do you meet much pushback? Would they come into our tent, or do you think they'd stay outside? Or do you make efforts to actually reach those people, or does it just within the racing community, the racing bubble?
I've had a lot reach out to us in terms of from external to the industry, but they tend to be the ones that obviously want to also, push the right messages and drive the culture of the horse first in their sports too. In terms of engaging with people that don't want to discuss it, I guess we try, but there's not really any point in force feeding anybody anything, because they're not going to want to take in the information at all in the first place. So the way that I see it is I guess if you're talking, your tent, you've got your bubble, and then there's the next rung out, which could be your family and friends. Like I love, when Melbourne Cup rolls around and the absolute, the frenzy of up to the cup and aggravation against horse racing comes out in Australia. I love, my mum always, she's like, oh, horse racing can't be cruel because Vicky loves it and she loves animals. I'm like, love you, mum, but that's probably not a great answer. Like, I want to actually give you some resources so that you can find out what their concerns are and communicate it. So the next rung out from us is, of course, people who know that it's not, they've had enough experience with the industry to want to communicate it properly. And so if we can educate them, that's amazing, because that's a whole nother big group of people. And then, of course, the picture is that then you can get out to maybe some sports fans, or that people that don't understand in the next layer out, and hope this is where a snowball analogy really works, where it keeps growing and growing and growing, and by the end of it, you've normalized a lot of this information and a lot of this access that previously we're bad at keeping just within ourselves and within our bubble. I mean, like, you only got to look at some of the incredible work that's done by universities and vets all over the world, and a lot of it doesn't even reach the industry, let alone anybody remotely outside it. I mean, scientists are great, but they're not great marketers. So making sure that information is palatable and it's distilled so it's understandable, and then put out in a way that's actually interesting, entertaining, and engaging is really important.
I was just going to say, apart from the communication, which is obviously really important, is there within your framework communication about, like, actually changing practices? So, like, it's one thing to promote the good things about the industry, which I think is fantastic. But is there part of your strategy to sort of help the industry, I guess, reflect on its practices and where the opportunities are for improvement? Is that part of the strategy?
I mean, that's the fourth pillar, right? That's accountability. We try not to do that in public, to be honest, because, this is a tricky one for me to answer. I'm just trying to think how to answer it. But, we don't want to say you want to cancel each other out.
Yeah, it's kind of like washing your dirty linen in public. You don't necessarily want to do that, but I know exactly what you're trying to say.
But, like, part of building that whole credibility almost is doing the dirty laundry in public, like, without obviously destroying the industry. Yeah.
To a point. I do it to a far probably more aggressive point than most.
Yeah.
Like the blog that went out about earlier this week about our industry needing to be more realistic about what's going to actually bring it down. Like, I had so many messages. I had 100 messages from people being like, gosh, you're bold, or, oh, what's this person said about it? And I don't even think it was particularly controversial. Like, it felt like common sense. So it's, I mean, I guess there's not enough of that. I would do it more than most, and as a result, there's certain leaders in the industry in Australia that, let's just say I'm not on their Christmas card list. Because I've called it out really publicly, really regularly, and put it in writing. Because because I also own a media publication, so we have that vehicle. My business partner is a guy called Gary King. He's a superstar, and he's as passionate about this as I am. So we would push the envelope on a lot of topics, way more than I think possibly any other publication in this area, because we own the publication. So we can. But a lot wouldn't run it. A lot wouldn't publish. Like what I wrote, this week, a lot would not run it, would not have even picked it up. So unfortunately, that's the side that they don't want to admit. And one of the big issues, it's also, I guess there's two sides to every coin. the racing industry has a lot of control over the mainstream media in Australia because they advertise so heavily. That's great in that it gets us enormous exposure when we need great stuff to be amplified, but it means that there's a muffle. There's a complete muffle put on any negativity being remotely discussed, and it protects our leadership in a way that doesn't allow for accountability and is not okay. And that's actually what's being challenged at the moment in Parliament in New South Wales. That sort of power is, I've had several people say to me that I'm not allowed to be on their show because a certain racing leader has said that I'm not to have a voice. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I try and do as much as I can without getting a muzzle, I guess, put on me completely. But owning the publication is what's made the most difference, to be honest.
I feel like that is just such an amazing insight for people.
I mean, I've felt the same pressures, and I could not have done this podcast a year ago when I was involved in racing governance and regulation. It just would not have been it wouldn't have been possible anyway. But this has freed me up, and even now I still struggle to articulate my deeply held views on some things because I just think just need to be careful here. And as you say, you are able to get it out there, and I think that's really, really powerful.
I think also I've got a very strong relationship with my old boss at Arrowfield, John Massara, who's been a very close mentor, and he's very passionate on this as well. And he's always, puts the horse's welfare before all other. In fact, that's what caused the Danehill agreement to fall apart all those years ago, was that he was like, we don't know the impacts of shuttle stallions, we have to give them a rest. And that was what actually completely caused that relationship to need to go to a Dutch auction and get the horse sold between Arrowfield and Cornwall. But so I run a lot of stuff past him because he's politically one of the smartest people you can come across. And so I ran that article past him, and he said, you're going to get kickback. And I was like, yep, that's fine. And he said, do you right now, do you want to deal with that? And I said, he asked the right questions, and it allows me to have a barometer check on what to push and what not to push. And I said, I fundamentally believe this with every fibre of my being, and I think, to be honest, it's just common sense. And he said, completely agree. I think you should go for it. So it helps having other people that are in your corner, and you have, and I run stuff past Meta quite often, and check in with Gary, who's my business partner, and you surround yourself with like-minded people that get it, right? That have the same value system as you. Yeah. It does mean challenging those that don't.
Mm. Mm-hmm. And the incredible thing about that is it's probably people like you and Meta who, if the industry is going to have a future, it's probably going to come about because you guys have started this ball rolling.
But you know what they always say, nothing worth doing is ever easy.
Yeah, totally.
At the end of the day, I've noticed, so to the point that I'm actually reorientating a lot of my resources within my company now, I've noticed a huge demand for what we do, what we talk about, and the fact that we're approaching it with common sense, not with our head in the sands, and quite openly. So I'm working with an international company at the moment that has got a fantastic model around aftercare, and what they're doing is world leading. They've brought me in to work with them on a project to go through their aftercare program and find gaps about where they could be vulnerable, and then that conversation where you raise conversations around communication gaps, that shows them, there's a genuine gap here, we've got to fix it. So what's been quite useful is the skill set of going in with the communications, marketing and PR, I suppose, helmet on. You have to shine a light on dark corners, because you can't prepare crisis comms plans or work out areas of vulnerability without being super honest about where everything's in reality and through a public lens is sitting. And by raising those conversations, you go, oh God, we need to fix this, right? So this is actually a genuine problem. And at the very least, we need to be progressing towards a better target. And as soon as you've got progress towards a better target, you're fine. You'll be able to work through it. And as long as you're genuinely working towards that milestone within a realistic and achievable time frame, it'll be okay, and we'll get there. So it opens up a lot of conversations that would previously have been awkward because you were just addressing them from that welfare lens. But if you address it from a, this will ruin your reputation, but here's what you can do to try and fix it, it's just a softer conversation, and they get that it's actually a survival problem. But the challenge for an organisation like them is that the live export of cattle in Australia, that was shut down from a documentary that aired on a Sunday night. By Friday, that industry was closed, done, finished, because of the public pressure and the political pressure that came on so quickly. That pressure didn't come from the Indonesian government, you know, that received the cattle where the slaughterhouses were treating these animals incorrectly. It came from the Australian government that were exporting these. So this is where they realise that if they can make sure they meet the expectations of their market, then it's going to protect them in their entire business model. Looking at it from that sort of full business model completeness, I find is a very comfortable way to approach a conversation. And it's quite a safe space then, because you're actually looking at what's something that could actually overnight end an industry if it was a bad enough situation. On that though, it's interesting once we got into the conversation about all the incredible things they were doing, they were, I suppose, reluctant to promote it because they were worried that it wasn't perfect. And I think that comes up actually quite a lot in this conversation, is that people are so worried about not being perfect they don't say anything at all. And we've got to get better at showing progress as well as, you know, the great outcomes that we get to.
It really, really resonates with me because I feel those pressures all the time. I mean, Karen will know. It's so hard to navigate. There's so much, so many forces that are potentially lining up against you, and you're just trying to. But all we're trying to do is make the racing world a better place, the horse sport world a better place. Yeah,
that's it. Yeah. I mean, we're talking about communication and business, and I'm trying to help you with your business, and all of a sudden the welfare conversation is okay to have.
It's risk that all of them have on their risk radar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So if you address it from that perspective, then it's normalised as a business. It becomes a business conversation, not an emotional woo-woo topic, I guess.
Yeah.
Is perhaps what it does, but like I have these conversations with these organisations now, and I said we need to have like a really frank conversation, and I was like, it's going to be awkward, by the way, but you've got to treat me like you wouldn't a defence attorney in a murder case, unless I know some of the bad stuff that's going on, unless we can actually speak openly about your areas of vulnerability, then we can't even remotely work towards producing a communications plan that's going to make sure that you don't fall victim to it. And that's then immediately, once you start talking about them as a vulnerability, as a certain area as a vulnerability, your next line of, you know, communication is, okay, what's being done to fix it? Because that's what your comms plan immediately has to go to anyway. And if they're like, nothing, it's like, okay, bang, first issue, you've got to deal with it, and we've got to find a genuine target and real steps that you're going to make and commit to get there. And so you're kind of making that address the problem through that, I guess, that risk profile, which is a lot more of a business lens, but it takes that emotion out of it.
I'd also suspect that once you talk about risk and reputation, you're more likely to engage with the CEO than the PR team. Do you know what I mean? You're going to get to the corner office because they're going to be seriously worried about shareholder expectation.
Well, there's not many things that could completely shut down an industry overnight, right? There's not many things. Like, we've got a lot of risks. Everybody's got a lot of challenges that we're looking towards, you know, with the economy, with wagering, with, you know, whether it's infrastructure or you know, doping positives. But there's not many scandals that could actually shut the gates. And wealth, I think nearly welfare is it. And so it's getting to the point that it's terrifying them, which is good. It should.
Yeah. I feel like that's a fabulous spot to end on.
Absolutely. It's going to galvanise me anyway, that we're this is what we're trying to do too. We're not trying to scare people, but this is the reality, folks. And we're all going to have to embrace a new way of thinking, and we're hoping that by listening to this podcast, hearing what our guests have to say, it stimulates people to talk, have conversations, and really address what is probably the fundamental issue facing the future of horse sport. Thanks so much, Vicky, for coming to chat to us today. We really appreciate it. Keep up the good work. It's really, really encouraging.
Thank you. Thanks very much for having me on.